Okay, so I think maybe it was 2 days ago I bought this really strong beer, and it said on the can like really strong beer, and it was 5.6, and yeah, I didn't know what to expect. They said there was going to be some kind of mango flavor to it, and there was, but I mean, when you first sip of that beer and you realize it's really, really strong beer. Um, in fact, after swallowing it, like the first sip, you kind of take a second look at the can to think, and you think like, was this made for human consumption? Anyway, since then I've been feeling really off. I've been feeling a little bit weird. Um, Nothing crazy, but I mean, and I'm sure there was a number of factors at play. But yeah, that beer really cemented it. Um, so yeah, I've just been feeling a little bit off. Um, I have a thing there. Anyway, so added to the whole weirdness, I I was faced with a number of things when it comes to antinatalism. So I posted this video on an antinatalist group the other day, and it was the opening scene of Prometheus. So, big alien white guy falls into a big lake, and he just, he disintegrates basically down to the DNA. And I got some, what do you call it? I got some blowback actually from posting it on the antinatalist site, because antinatalists just really don't like to compare antinatalism to suicide. Um, and and even David Benatar, I mean, from the horse's mouth, um, doesn't like saying that life needs to end. His philosophy basically promotes the idea that once born, you have a vested interest in continuing your life, um, because death would only mean suffering, and maybe not just suffering for the person who's dying, but death for but suffering for the people around the person who's dying. So there's an interest in continuing your life. There was an odd question that Sam Harris asked them on the Waking Up podcast about that very notion, about the idea if there were no consequences to a person dying, or dare I say committing suicide, does that kind of relegate the whole idea of antinatalism not supporting um, suicide? And I forget the exact response, but I mean, technically, in that hypothetical situation, Sam Harris would be right. If there were no consequences to ending somebody's life, or ending your own life, then what would be the drawback, considering an antinatalist framework? But I myself don't advocate suicide or for suicide. I don't believe that people should commit suicide. Although I do think when you're talking about antinatalism, there's this misconception about what it is, and I think some of that some of that discussion flows into um, the policy of euthanasia in Canada. And all through all the news stories I've read about euthanasia, and the trials and tribulations of implementing the policy across um, medical institutions, hospitals, etc., with doctors who are of varying minds when it comes to religion and antinatalism, religion and euthanasia, etc., etc. Sorry, not religion and antinatalism, but religion and euthanasia. There was not one mention of antinatalism. There was not a mention of that philosophy. Um, so antinatalism is really kind of on the sidelines. I mean, it does not get talked about a lot, and recently it's been being talked about a lot, um, and even then, not too much. It's not the main subject. Um, so the other day too, I'm reading this article about the birth strike movement, which also is a movement considering the idea. In principle, it's the same idea, like you not having children because of the suffering they would endure because of environmental degradation or climate change. Um, but they definitely do make a point, or at least in the article I read, they make a point of distancing themselves from antinatalism. So that's not quite suicide, but it's still the idea of not bringing life into the world. And they do it for reasons that they claim are very altruistic in the sense of not wanting their children to suffer through the effects of climate change. So that's admirable, etc., etc. But like I said before, I don't advocate for antinatalism on the grounds of environmental consequences or for the effects of climate change on offspring. I think there's an inherent suffering with human beings that happens, and that's the grounds on with and you know the whole environmental or climate change thing. That's sort of like another layer on top of the core concept that, as I see it, you know, I think that human beings just naturally on their own just kind of suffer. I think it's a very integrated part of being human being, of being a human being. You suffer, and that's you know when it comes to the asymmetry argument, the axiological asymmetry. I think the suffering does weigh in more than any pleasure you could find. So interestingly enough, I'm watching this Rubin report with Nicholas Christakis, and he's a sociologist, but he was really focusing on evolution and evolutionary traits that affect human society and human behavior, both on group levels and individual levels. And he made a great point that relates to my previous point about the innate ability, or not even ability, but the innate propensity for human beings to weigh in on suffering more than they do on pleasure. And according to Nicholas Christakis, evolution allows for people to just notice things that are harmful more than they would things that are benign or pleasurable. It just makes evolutionary sense, and it makes sense for survival as an individual. So you know, there's some science behind the whole asymmetry argument. Maybe I'm a little bit off on that one, but I see a correlation there that's almost very direct, if not just direct. So that does happen, and I don't think that that's without. I don't think that's with any controversy. So on three levels, you kind of have people on the ground, like say in that antinatalist group, and you have, you know, some of the higher ups, like say Nicholas Christakis, who although he claims he is an optimist, he did say that on the Rubin report, and I don't think he believes in antinatalism. In fact, Nicholas Christakis actually does not think that would be beneficial to society, and he didn't say that directly. He didn't address antinatalism directly, but he did say that anytime there is some sort of hegemonic push for structures and policies and systems that go against human nature, it always ends badly. So we think about things like communism, socialism, you know, even anarchy. These things are extremes on either side of the fence, and they always end badly. So there's a fine balance that human beings play when it comes to systems that address their natural functioning. So he even threw in stuff like marriage and the institution of marriage and the way that supports evolutionary behavior, pair bonding, I guess, I don't know. But so you have this guy talking about, Nicholas Christakis talking about, you know, people noticing things that are harmful to them, more so than they do notice things that are beneficial or pleasurable. But you also have people like you know, David Benatar, who argues against suicide, and you also have people on the ground, like in these antinatalist groups, arguing against suicide, and kind of having this kind of repulsion when it comes to equating antinatalism with suicide. I also don't equate antinatalism with suicide, but in a strange way, we are all slowly dying. I mean, we're all slowly killing ourselves. You know, we're all gonna die. So I mean, there's some overtones. There's some little inflections that kind of make the two relate. But I wanted to make this video to say that no, antinatalism does not advocate for suicide. Like that's not what it does. You know, in the antinatalist community, you know, talking about some of the big guys and the small guys, and even myself, you know, the antinatalism is not suicide. Like it isn't. Um, but it's funny though, because in some of these antinatalist groups, people will post things that directly relate to suicide, and these posts go unmoderated, like nobody notices them, or people even comment very favorably when it comes to some of these. I guess it's the way it's phrased or termed, or I don't know, whatever. But sometimes you post other stuff, and you know, you just get this like huge backlash, like, you know, oh, how dare you equate antinatalism with suicide, blah blah blah. So I just want to say, like, no, there is, you know, there is no equation between antinatalism and suicide necessarily. I'm sure there's little kind of cul-de-sacs of meaning when it comes to those two things. But yeah, there's nothing directly tying them together, in the sense that it fits into the antinatalist philosophy. So that's all I want to say. You know, Nicholas Christakis' interview with Dave Rubin was quite interesting. The whole idea that systems that go against human nature automatically fail, I think, is a very important to my whole idea, or my thinking that antinatalism is not very practical, and I don't think that would ever be adopted by anybody on the planet Earth, except for a very few. But you know, I guess for what it's worth, I mean, the antinatalist philosophy just kind of stands in this kind of stark kind of reminder of life. And you know, however you want to take the absurdity of life, I think we all know it. We all see it on a daily basis. I don't think it's that far removed from daily life. Just the absurd shit you see in life every day. Anyway, that's all I want to say. Bye.